I still remember the day everything shifted. It was a bright morning, filled with the promise of celebration. Teresa, my stepdaughter, had been accepted into college, and Paul, my husband, had just received a promotion at work. We had planned a family gathering that evening, something I thought would finally bring us closer after years of strained tension. But when I came home that afternoon, the sight that met me shattered any illusion of normalcy I had left. Garbage bags were piled high on the front lawn, overflowing with my clothes and books, some of them spilling across the grass. For a moment, I thought it must be a mistake, perhaps someone had gotten confused and thrown out the wrong bags. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. These were my things. I rushed inside, my heart pounding, hoping there was some explanation. But what I found upstairs was worse than I could have imagined. In the middle of our bedroom stood Paul, Teresa, and my mother-in-law, cheerfully tossing the rest of my belongings into garbage bags. They barely glanced up when I burst in. "Come on, hurry up," Teresa said, her voice flat but laced with a note of smugness. "Grandma needs to move in, and you're still here." "Exactly," Paul added, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "We don't need a failure like you around." My mother-in-law, who had never liked me, chuckled softly. "Thanks for the college money, though. We'll take that." I stood frozen in disbelief, my whole body numb. Paul's face was cold, emotionless. Teresa looked at me with disdain, and my mother-in-law, well, her contempt was nothing new. But this was something else. It was as if I wasn't a person to them anymore, just an inconvenience they were finally rid of. Then Paul laughed. The sound cut through the air like glass, and something inside me broke. "You, working $10 an hour, really thought you'd be worth something?" he sneered. "You're nothing. Get out." A cold shiver ran through me, but this time it wasn't fear. It was anger. No, anger wasn't enough. It was resolve. For the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. I felt empowered. "I'll leave," I said, my voice steady even as my hands trembled. I turned and walked out without another word. Outside, the garbage bags still lay in the yard. I collected them, my clothes, my books, my memories, and shoved them into my car. I drove away, my vision blurred with tears. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I wouldn't let them see me break. This wasn't the end. It wasn't supposed to be like this. 12 years ago, when I first met Paul, he had been kind, gentle even. We met through work, and his cheerful, outgoing nature drew me in. He was everything I wasn't: confident, happy, and full of life. At the time, I was shy, uncertain of myself, and afraid of what the future held. Paul made me feel like I was someone special, someone worthy of love. We dated for a year before he proposed. I was flustered. I had never seen myself as the type of woman someone would want to marry. I wasn't glamorous or outgoing. I was simple, but Paul made me feel cherished, like I was enough. He introduced me to his 9-year-old daughter, Teresa, who seemed sweet and shy, just like I had been at her age. We got along well, or so I thought. Everything seemed perfect. Our wedding was small, modest, just close friends and family. It felt like the beginning of a new life, one I had longed for. But it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. At first, it was little things. Paul's mother would visit, and though she pretended to be polite at first, her true nature soon came through. "Kelly, there's dust on the shelf," she'd say, inspecting every corner of the house. "Don't you clean properly?" I smiled, doing my best to be the perfect daughter-in-law. I tried to brush off her comments, but nothing was ever enough. Paul started to change, too. Though at first I didn't notice. He would make small, cutting remarks about my cooking or the state of the house, always comparing me to his mother, who had been a full-time homemaker. "You only work part-time," Paul said one night, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Shouldn't you have more time to make proper meals?" My mother never used store-bought food. I wanted to argue, to explain how hard it was to balance work and running the house, but I didn't. I just nodded, silently vowing to do better. I stayed up late, making everything from scratch, hoping if I worked harder, things would go back to how they were. But they didn't. As the years passed, Paul's treatment worsened. Teresa, once sweet, began to mirror him. She stopped calling me Kelly and started referring to me as the old lady. Each time, it stung, but I told myself it was just a phase. Maybe when she left for college, things would improve. I convinced myself that deep down, Teresa was still the girl I had met, but the truth was, they had both changed, or perhaps they had always been this way, and I had just been too blind to see it. Paul's verbal abuse grew sharper with every passing day. "I come home tired, and this is what I get?" he'd say, throwing his lunchbox onto the counter with a loud clatter. "Frozen food and leftovers. Do you even care about me?" It didn't matter how many times I tried to explain that preparing fresh meals every day was exhausting. It didn't matter that I stayed up late, carefully cooking and making sure everything was perfect. Nothing I did was ever enough. And, just like that, Teresa would echo her father's words, falling in line with his cruelty. "She's right, Dad. You should be grateful we're even eating her food at all," Teresa would say, arms crossed, her voice laced with contempt. I swallowed my anger, biting my tongue every time. I told myself, over and over, that if I could just hold on a little longer, things would change. Teresa's college acceptance would be the turning point. I convinced myself, once she was gone, Paul would ease up, maybe even become reasonable again. And maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to the life we once had, the life I thought we could build together. That hope was shattered the day I found my belongings tossed out like garbage. The moment I left the house, I knew there was no going back, but as I drove, something inside me shifted. I wasn't the timid woman they had taken advantage of anymore. I was done. I pulled into a gas station, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and called my uncle. He had always been there for me, even after my parents passed away when I was young. He'd raised me like his own, helped me find my footing after college. When I told him what had happened, his voice was sharp with anger. "You can stay in one of our dorms until you get back on your feet," he said, without hesitation. I accepted his offer, grateful that, for once, someone cared. That night, I moved into a small, quiet room in the dorm, away from the chaos of my old life. The next few days were spent drying out my clothes, still damp from the rain, and gathering my thoughts. I had never lived alone before, but somehow, in that moment, it felt freeing. I wasn't sad about losing Paul or Teresa anymore. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was determined. They had taken so much from me, my time, my energy, my sense of self, but they wouldn't take anything more. Not now, not ever again. A month passed quietly, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. I focused on myself for the first time in forever. I started writing again, a hobby I'd abandoned during my marriage. It was a small joy, but it reminded me of who I used to be, before I became Paul's wife, before I became Teresa's stepmother. Then, out of nowhere, Paul called. I didn't answer at first. I let it go to voicemail, expecting more demands or insults, more of the same. But the messages that followed were different. "Kelly, please pick up the phone." His voice was strained, almost desperate. "Something's wrong. Teresa's college enrollment has been cancelled." I smiled as I listened to the voicemail. Of course, it had been cancelled. I cancelled it. I had withdrawn all the tuition money from the account and moved it into one under my name. Teresa wasn't going to college, not with the money I had saved. When I finally picked up Paul's call, he sounded beside himself. "You had no right. That money was for Teresa. She worked hard to get into that school." I stayed calm, not raising my voice. There was no need to. Did she? Because from what I remember, Teresa spent most of her time partying, not studying. College was just another excuse for her to spend money. Paul was furious, and I could almost hear his fists clenching through the phone, but I didn't care. "You're petty. You're doing this out of spite." "No, Paul," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "I'm doing this because you and Teresa used me. You took advantage of my kindness, my patience, and my money. But it ends now." He hung up, but the calls didn't stop. He kept calling, kept leaving desperate messages, begging me to return the money, telling me that without it, Teresa couldn't enroll in another college. But I didn't care. They had taken enough from me. Teresa would have to figure out her own future. And Paul, well, Paul would have to live with the consequences of his actions. A few weeks later, I received another call. This time, Paul sounded more frantic than ever. "My promotion's been cancelled," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been demoted." I wasn't surprised. My uncle, who owned a large company that had ties with Paul's employer, had found out about the way Paul had treated me. In retaliation, he pulled strings, forcing the company to demote Paul. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. Maybe you should have treated me better, I replied coldly, without an ounce of sympathy. Paul pleaded with me to talk to my uncle, to convince him to change his mind, but I refused. He had brought this on himself. In the months that followed, I rebuilt my life, piece by piece. I filed for divorce and reclaimed the money that was rightfully mine. Paul and Teresa tried to fight it, but they didn't stand a chance. I had all the evidence in years of verbal abuse, how they had used me, and Paul's financial manipulation. In the end, they owed me compensation, and I made sure they paid every cent. One day, long after the dust had settled, I got another call from Paul. His voice was quiet, defeated. "They're making us move out of the house," he said. "It's your house, after all." I had almost forgotten. The house we had lived in, the one I had been thrown out of, was in my name. It had been a gift from my uncle when Paul and I first married. Paul hadn't known, but now he had no choice but to leave. As I hung up the phone, I smiled for the first time in a long time. I had won.